Good evening, folks, and welcome back to day number 36 of the Bible in 365. Today we are taking a look at Leviticus 15:1 to 18:18. Y'all know the drill. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, folks. So our story picks up today in Leviticus chapter 15. And let me tell you what, you are a courageous man if you are willing to preach Leviticus 15 to 15-year-olds because it's got some serious stuff in there and it's got the topics that nobody wants to talk about. But here I am. I am making this video and I am going to talk about it. So, Leviticus chapter 15 essentially sets down laws by God regarding purity and protection from disease. So, Leviticus 15 starts out talking about bodily discharges and how to handle them. Yes, I said bodily discharges. Essentially, God said that any man that has a running sore contaminates everything, yes, everything that he sits or lies upon. And then also anything that he touched or anyone who he touched was deemed unclean. So that person and the man as well had to wash his clothes and his body and would be unclean until the evening time. Now, if this man who had this sore put his hands on a vessel, that like a vase or a pot, that vessel had to be shattered. Shattered, right? If he touched wood, the wood could just be washed off. And so it gives us all these processes. Now, after the man was cured of this sore, he had to wait 7 days and then wash himself, wash his clothes before he would be considered clean again. And on the 8th day, he would have to go before the priest in the temple or the tent of meeting and hand over 2 young pigeons or turtle doves. And the priest would offer them as essentially a atonement for the man's state of uncleanliness. Now, or what's interesting about this bodily discharge is it doesn't really describe it fully. A lot of people have speculated it's some type of disease. Some people have said maybe it's some sort of an STD. But this first part of Leviticus chapter 15 is talking about an infection. And they're worried about that spreading. That's why it's the 7 days and the washing to get rid of this contamination, essentially. Now, Leviticus 15 also talks about bodily fluids, and this is talking about seminal fluid. And so, essentially here, every piece of clothing or skin that seminal fluid touched had to be washed, and the skin and the clothing would be considered unclean until evening. Now, if a woman had been with a man, she also had to bathe and she would be considered unclean until evening. Now, a woman who was menstruating would be considered unclean and she had to be separated from the general population for 7 days. And the guidelines that applied to a man with a running sore also applied to women who were menstruating. So they were separated for 7 days and then they had to come and offer an atonement by bringing the 2 turtle doves before the priests and for those to be offered up. Now, at the end of chapter 15, it does say that God gives this reasoning for the guidelines. The laws were designed to keep the holy tent consecrated and clean. So if the holy tent or the tent of meeting was defiled, then God said the Israelites would have to die. And so this is really this idea of ritual purity or cleanliness is the reason why these procedures or rules or rituals needed to be followed. All right, folks, so now we are moving forward to Leviticus chapter 16. In Leviticus chapter 16, it outlines God's rules and procedures that were to be followed on the Day of Atonement. So the Day of Atonement was a day when Aaron was to atone for himself and his entire family. So Aaron had to go into the holy tabernacle, and on this day he bathed, put on his sacred attire, and he was to bring a sin offering and a burnt offering to be sacrificed at the altar. And so there was a bull for the sin offering and a ram for the burnt offering, and these were to be sacrificed. And it was meant to atone for the sins of his family. Now, Leviticus 16 then continues to detail the process that Aaron had to go through on the Day of Atonement. So after he entered into the tent of meeting, he was to take off his clothes, wash his body with the water from the holy place. Then he put his clothes back on and offer up the burnt offering for himself and his people. From there, the skins and the other parts of the sacrificed animals were to be burned in the fire that is outside of the camp. And at this point in time, the person or the man who burned the carcasses would have to cleanse himself so that he could return to camp. So it's all, once again, about this purity. And then it does say that this law, this purification ritual, would be done every year to cleanse the Israelites from sin, and it would continue forever. Moving forward to chapter 17. In chapter 17 of Leviticus, it discusses some additional rules with regards to sacrificing animals and how to handle the blood properly. And so essentially here, what is noted is that this tent of meeting, this sacred place, was the only place that an Israelite was allowed to make a sacrifice. So if a person was found sacrificing an animal in an unholy place, they were guilty of shedding blood, essentially like unlawful killing or kind of like murder. And so the consequences would be they would be cut off from the community. They would be cast out. And so the reason given for sacrificing animals in the tent of meeting was so that the priest could perform the proper ritual. And in addition, the sacrifice could be shared with people as a form of fellowship. And so atonement could be made by the priest on behalf of the Israelite community. Now, further down in chapter 17 of Leviticus, it discusses that no one should ever consume blood. Yeah, so vampires couldn't be a thing. But no, in all seriousness, if someone was found guilty of consuming blood, they were to be cut off from the community. And so essentially the reason behind this rule was God is responsible for creating life in all creatures. So the blood that runs through one creature is what was used by the Israelites to atone for sin. So this blood made the atonement for one's transgressions possible. And in addition, when an Israelite went hunting for food, the animal that was killed had its blood drained. So the blood was to then be covered by dirt. And so it's this sanctity of life, but then also realizing that blood was shed and poured out for atonement. Lastly, within the chapter, there are a few rules regarding the handling of animals and the ones that are found dead because of natural causes. So if a person was to eat the meat of an animal that had died because of natural causes, they had to wash their clothes, take a bath, and this was done in order to avoid contamination by the dead animal, any disease that it may have carried. And so then the rules continue in detail, and it gives the importance of giving an animal sacrifice for food or fellowship to the Lord. And so if the life of an animal that was slaughtered or by natural causes had died was not offered to the Lord, it was considered going against God. And so once again, it's this idea that you offer every life up to God, and it's an important part of honoring and glorifying God. All right, folks, moving forward to Leviticus chapter 18. Leviticus chapter 18 talks all about guidelines that were given by God regarding unlawful sexual relations. Yes, yet another topic that a lot of people don't want to preach on. But so God gives rules regarding sex. And so at the beginning of the chapter, we see that God or the Lord speaks to Moses to inform him that the Israelites were not allowed to behave like the Egyptians. And so all of the sexual practices from Egypt were not to be performed in the land of Canaan. And so this is because the Lord noted that he was the source of all civil and moral laws, and they were to obey him without question. Now, at this point in time, God begins to list restricted relations. So he lists the practices which he did not approve of. So essentially, people weren't allowed to have sex with close relatives. So incestual relations. So you can't have sex with their mother, stepmother, sister, half-sister, stepsister, in-laws. And this is all against God's plan and wishes. Couldn't have sex with a neighbor's wife, and how this was also an offense against God. And you couldn't have same-sex relations or bestiality. So these things are all mentioned as well. So it is here with this list of essentially rules and regulations of what the Lord did not approve of when it comes to the practice of sex that we end our discussion for today. All right, folks. I hope that you join me tomorrow as we pick up here at the end of Leviticus chapter 18, beginning in verse 19. And we're going to discuss all the way through Leviticus chapter 21, ending in chapter 24. I hope you've had an excellent day. And as always, folks, God bless.